It wasn't the heat of the coffee that made her freeze. It was the silence. The heavy, suffocating kind of silence that follows an act so wrong it steals the air from the room. One moment, she was standing quietly in line, her hands folded, her gaze low, her voice never raised above a whisper. The next, the paper cup tilted in the security guard's hand, releasing a stream of scalding liquid across her blouse, dark stains blooming over pale fabric. The hiss of liquid hitting cotton was louder than the gasps that never came. No one stepped forward. No one asked if she was hurt. The guard didn't apologize. He didn't even look sorry. Instead, his eyes held that cold, familiar sharpness, the kind that doesn't see a person, only a stereotype. Around them, the morning rush continued. Cups clinked. Chairs scraped against tile. Somewhere, a phone buzzed. And still, she stood there, unmoving, unreadable. The guard's lips curled into the faintest smirk, as if daring her to speak. She didn't. She simply reached for a napkin, her hands steady, her face calm in a way that made his arrogance sharpen. What he didn't know, what no one in that moment could have guessed, was that this quiet woman wasn't just a random customer. She was someone whose presence in this place carried a weight he couldn't imagine. Because she was the mother of the man who owned it. The woman's name was Evelyn Carter. 61 years old. A mother of 2. A grandmother of 3. And someone who had spent her life moving through the world quietly, not because she lacked strength, but because she had learned that silence often gave her more power than words ever could. Born in a small town in Mississippi, Evelyn had grown up in the thick of a world that still believed in keeping certain lines drawn. Her childhood was filled with those quiet, unspoken rules, where you could walk, how you could speak, when you were supposed to smile. And over time, she learned the art of blending in, of moving through spaces without drawing attention. But blending in didn't mean she was invisible. Evelyn had a way of noticing everything. She could read a room in seconds, sense tension before it was visible, and spot the shift in a person's eyes before their words revealed their intentions. Years ago, she had raised her children in a neighborhood where dreams often stopped at the edge of the block. But she refused to let those limits define her family. Her eldest son, Marcus, had inherited her quiet determination, but unlike his mother, he had a fire that demanded to be seen. That fire had taken him from a teenager working late-night shifts at a burger stand to the owner of one of the most successful soul food restaurants in the city. The place wasn't just a business. It was a symbol. Every wall, every table, every framed photograph told a story, not just of Marcus's success, but of a community's resilience. It was the kind of restaurant where everyone was welcome, where you could taste the history in every bite, where laughter seemed to stick to the walls. Evelyn visited often, though never with fanfare. She didn't walk in announcing herself as the owner's mother. She didn't sit at a table reserved for special guests. She came like any other customer, waited in line, and paid for her meal. To her, the joy was in watching from the background, seeing how her son treated his staff like family, how customers left smiling, how the place hummed with the same warmth she had worked so hard to give her own home. On this particular morning, the sky had been a muted gray, the kind that hinted at rain without ever delivering it. Evelyn had slipped on her favorite cream blouse, the one with the delicate embroidery along the sleeves, and made her way to the restaurant for her usual breakfast, black coffee and a biscuit. Inside, the place was busy. The air smelled of fresh bread, sizzling bacon, and brewed coffee. The line was long, winding toward the counter. Evelyn stood patiently near the back, her eyes scanning the menu she already knew by heart. She noticed a new face near the entrance. A tall man in a dark security uniform, broad-shouldered, with a rigid stance that seemed less about protection and more about control. He wasn't a regular. Marcus had never hired security before. The restaurant had never needed it. But lately, the city had been buzzing about a string of incidents in nearby shops, and perhaps Marcus thought it wise to have someone keep an eye on things. From the moment Evelyn saw him, she noticed his eyes. They weren't scanning for danger. They were scanning for something else, something smaller, pettier, meaner. He watched certain customers longer than others. And when his gaze landed on her, it lingered. Evelyn kept her eyes down. Not out of fear, but because she knew the power of not giving certain people the satisfaction they sought. She shuffled forward in line as the morning crowd moved, her mind already wandering to her garden at home and the hydrangeas that needed pruning. She didn't notice the security guard moving closer until his shadow fell over her. It was subtle at first, a presence at the edge of her awareness. Then came the slow, deliberate steps, the scrape of his boots against the tile, the faint clink of something in his hand. She glanced sideways, just enough to see the steaming paper cup he held loosely, dangerously tilted. She thought nothing of it at first. Maybe he was taking it to someone. Maybe he was on a break. But then, without warning, the cup tipped further, a stream of dark coffee spilling forward, hitting her blouse in a sharp, scalding wave. The liquid soaked into the cream fabric instantly, turning it a deep brown, the heat biting into her skin. Evelyn inhaled sharply, not in pain, but in the shock of the act itself. The air around them shifted. People noticed, she could feel their eyes, but no one moved. The guard's face was expressionless, his lips barely curling in something that might have been a smirk. He didn't speak. He didn't apologize. Evelyn stood still, her back straight, her chin slightly lifted. She reached for the napkin dispenser, her movements measured and calm. She dabbed at the stain, her hands steady, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be waiting for. To anyone watching, it looked like a small, ugly moment that would pass as quickly as it had come. But Evelyn knew better. Moments like this didn't just pass, they settled into the bones of a place, they revealed the truth about people. And though the guard didn't know it, this quiet, dignified woman he had just tried to humiliate was woven into the very foundation of the building he stood in. The coffee incident didn't end in that moment. Not for Evelyn. Not for the room. The air inside the restaurant carried a new weight, an unspoken tension that pressed down like humidity before a storm. People went back to their conversations, their meals, their scrolling phones, but their eyes flicked back to her from time to time. Some looked away quickly when caught. Others didn't bother to hide the curiosity in their stares. Evelyn, however, refused to shrink. She stayed in line. She kept her place, though she could feel the dampness seeping through the fabric of her blouse, the sticky warmth clinging to her skin. She could have stepped out, could have gone to the restroom to clean herself up, could have left entirely. But walking away now would be a silent agreement that what had just happened was acceptable. And Evelyn Carter had lived too long, seen too much, to let silence be mistaken for consent. The security guard lingered near the entrance again, arms crossed, his stance wide, not guarding, but owning the space as if it belonged to him. His eyes followed her every move, not with curiosity, but with calculation. It wasn't the first time she'd seen that look in a man's eyes. She'd seen it at school meetings when teachers assumed her son's late homework was a sign of laziness, not the result of helping her work an extra shift. She'd seen it at grocery stores when cashiers double-checked her bills for counterfeits. She'd seen it in job interviews when her words were met with polite nods but no offers. It was the gaze of someone who had already decided who you were before you'd spoken a word. When Evelyn reached the counter, the young cashier greeted her with a bright smile, though her eyes darted nervously toward the guard. She took Evelyn's order, black coffee, biscuit, and handed her the receipt with careful politeness. Evelyn thanked her and stepped to the side to wait. The guard moved again. Slowly, deliberately. His boots struck the tile like a metronome. He stopped close enough for her to feel his presence at her shoulder, not touching her, but close enough to make the intention clear. The scent of his coffee still hung in the air, bitter and sharp. Evelyn didn't turn to him. She didn't speak. She kept her eyes on the counter, watching as the barista slid a fresh cup of coffee toward her. She reached for it, wrapping her hands around the warmth, and carried it to an empty corner table. As she sat, she noticed something else, small moments she had overlooked before. A couple near the door who had been greeted warmly by the guard on their way in. A delivery driver whose cheerful morning was met with a nod and a smile. But whenever a certain type of customer entered, young black men in hoodies, older black women carrying grocery bags, the guard's posture stiffened, his eyes narrowed. It was subtle, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. But Evelyn had spent her life looking. She knew the signs. Over the next 30 minutes, she sipped her coffee slowly, letting the restaurant's rhythm play out. The guard moved about, speaking to some customers in low tones, adjusting chairs, hovering near tables that didn't seem to need him. He never once approached her directly again, but his eyes never softened. By the time she finished her biscuit, Evelyn had decided she would speak to Marcus. Not because she wanted the guard fired, not yet, but because this was his place, his dream, and it was being poisoned by the presence of someone who treated it like his personal territory. She rose from her table, her blouse still stained, and made her way toward the back office. But as she passed the guard, he stepped slightly into her path, not blocking her fully, but enough to force a moment of decision. She paused, meeting his eyes for the first time since the coffee had spilled. And what she saw there wasn't guilt. It wasn't even indifference. It was the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed he'd reminded her of her place. Evelyn walked around him without a word. In the office, Marcus wasn't there. His desk was tidy, a sign he hadn't yet arrived for the day. She considered waiting, but something in her told her this needed to be addressed differently. She didn't want to meet arrogance with anger. She wanted to let it reveal itself. So she left the office, returned to the dining area, and chose a seat where she could see both the entrance and the guard. She stayed there for another hour, watching. She saw the way he leaned against the wall, scanning customers like a predator scanning a field. She saw how his posture shifted depending on who entered, loose for some, rigid for others. She saw the slight curl of his lip when a young mother with 2 small children walked in, her clothes worn but clean. It was all there, in the little details. The same pattern she had seen for decades, the same quiet, cutting prejudice that didn't need to shout to do damage. And as the morning gave way to the lunchtime rush, Evelyn made her decision. She wouldn't confront him here. Not in front of an audience that might turn the moment into a spectacle. She would wait until the time was right, when every mask had been dropped, when the truth stood naked and undeniable. Because people like him didn't just show you who they were once. They showed you over and over, if you stayed long enough to watch. By the time the lunch crowd swelled, the restaurant's hum had turned into a steady roar, plates clinking, conversations overlapping, the deep fryer hissing like a restless animal. The scent of fried chicken and cornbread drifted through the air, mixing with the sweet tang of collard greens. Evelyn remained in her corner, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. She wasn't here to enjoy her meal anymore, she was here to witness. Every moment that passed seemed to tighten the knot in her chest, not from anger, but from the weight of knowing what unchecked arrogance could do to a place. The guard moved with more confidence now. His earlier smirk had evolved into an ease, like someone who had tested the boundaries and found no resistance. He greeted a group of businessmen near the door with a firm handshake and a grin. He carried an extra chair to a table for an elderly white couple, his tone respectful, almost deferential. But when a group of black teenagers came in, laughing, shoving each other playfully, his stance changed. He didn't greet them. He positioned himself directly in their path, scanning their faces, making them pause mid-laughter. They hesitated, glanced at one another, and then moved on to a table in the back. Evelyn's hands tightened around her coffee cup. It was a small thing, but small things stacked up. That's how prejudice worked, not always in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of quiet, cutting moments until they became part of the air people breathed. Minutes later, a woman in a worn jacket approached the counter, her voice soft as she asked for a glass of water. The guard stepped in before the cashier could answer, his voice sharp, his body angled forward as if he were confronting a threat. Evelyn couldn't hear his exact words over the noise, but the woman's shrinking posture told her enough. She stepped back, mumbled something, and turned toward the door without ordering. The guard watched her leave, his expression unreadable, before resuming his post. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her resolve hardening. She would wait for Marcus to arrive. She wanted him to see it, not just hear her words, but witness the way this man handled people in his space. And then, as if on cue, Marcus appeared through the side entrance. Her son moved with the confidence of someone who had built something from nothing and knew the worth of it. He greeted the kitchen staff, clapped a delivery driver on the back, and made his way toward the counter. Evelyn didn't rise to meet him. Instead, she stayed in her seat, watching as the guard noticed him and straightened. Marcus extended a hand in greeting. The guard shook it, his expression respectful, his posture suddenly attentive. Evelyn could almost hear the change in tone, the shift from cold authority to warm professionalism. After a brief exchange, Marcus began making his rounds, speaking with customers, checking in with staff. It wasn't long before his eyes found Evelyn. His brow furrowed when he saw the stain on her blouse, but she gave a small shake of her head, a silent signal to wait. She wanted the truth to unfold naturally. And it did. It happened when a young delivery worker, thin, dark-skinned, wearing a faded baseball cap, stepped through the door carrying a stack of boxes. The guard moved quickly, blocking his path with one arm outstretched. The boxes wobbled dangerously in the worker's hands. Evelyn could see the confusion in the young man's face as the guard began questioning him, pointing toward the boxes as if they were a threat. The worker tried to explain, gesturing toward the kitchen, but the guard stepped closer, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. That was the moment Marcus intervened. He moved swiftly across the room, his voice calm but firm as he placed a hand on the worker's shoulder. He took the boxes himself, and nodded toward the kitchen. The young man hesitated, glanced at the guard, and then disappeared behind the swinging doors. Marcus turned to the guard. His expression was still controlled, but there was an edge in his tone now. Evelyn couldn't hear the words, but she saw the way the guard's shoulders squared, the way his jaw tightened. Whatever Marcus was saying, the guard didn't like it. And then, the moment Evelyn had been waiting for arrived. Marcus gestured toward her. The guard turned, his gaze following Marcus's hand until it landed on the quiet woman in the corner, the same woman he had doused with coffee hours earlier. Evelyn didn't move. She met his stare with the same calm, unshakable expression she had worn all morning. Marcus's words came next, short, clear, and final. The guard's eyes flickered, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, then to something closer to dread. Because now he knew. Now he understood exactly who she was. She wasn't just another customer. She wasn't someone passing through, someone whose presence could be dismissed or diminished. She was Evelyn Carter, the mother of Marcus Carter. The woman whose sacrifices had made this restaurant possible, whose love and labor had been poured into the foundation long before the first brick was laid. The guard's gaze faltered. He looked away first. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His posture, his tone, his steady gaze carried more weight than any shouting could. Whatever was said between them was brief, but it ended with the guard stepping back, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Marcus crossed the room and came to stand beside his mother. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The stain on her blouse, the look in her eyes, and the whispers among staff told the story well enough. Evelyn took a slow sip of her coffee, the warmth now comforting rather than bitter. She set the cup down, met her son's gaze, and gave a small nod. The guard disappeared minutes later, his boots striking the tile in retreat. He didn't look back. The restaurant seemed to exhale when he was gone. The hum of conversation returned, lighter now, as if a shadow had lifted from the room. Evelyn remained in her seat, the quiet center of a storm that had finally passed. She hadn't needed to raise her voice, hadn't needed to match aggression with aggression. She had let the truth reveal itself, and when it did, it spoke louder than anything she could have said. And the man who thought he could define her with a single act had been forced to see her in full, not as a target, not as a stereotype, but as the very heart of the place he had tried to dominate. When the door shut behind the guard, It wasn't just the sound of someone leaving. It was the sound of something being removed, a weight, a presence that had been pressing down on the space since morning. Evelyn stayed seated for a while longer, not out of hesitation, but because she wanted to feel the shift in the air. She wanted to notice the way conversations flowed more easily now, how customers smiled more freely, how the staff seemed to move with lighter steps. Marcus came back to her side, pulling out the chair opposite hers. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied her blouse, the coffee stain now a muted brown patch against the cream fabric. His jaw flexed, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. Evelyn listened, nodding occasionally, but she didn't tell him to fire the man. She didn't need to. Because this wasn't just about one act of rudeness or a single morning's humiliation. It was about the kind of energy you allow into the spaces you build. It was about how one person's prejudice, even if unspoken, can spread like smoke, invisible at first, but choking everything it touches if left unchecked. Marcus understood. He had built this restaurant on the foundation of his mother's values: dignity, respect, and the belief that every person who walked through the door deserved to feel welcome. The guard's presence had been a betrayal of that foundation. And like any cracked brick, it had to be replaced before the structure weakened. Evelyn sipped the last of her coffee, now lukewarm, and set the cup aside. She rose slowly, her movements unhurried, her back as straight as it had been all morning. Marcus walked her to the door, his hand light on her shoulder. Outside, the city moved as it always did, cars weaving through intersections, people rushing past with phones pressed to their ears, the low rumble of life carrying on. But Evelyn took her time, each step deliberate, as if to remind herself that no one had the power to push her from her own pace. In the days that followed, word spread quietly among the staff and regular customers about what had happened. Some were shocked. Others weren't. Prejudice has a way of revealing itself in small moments, and many realized they had seen signs long before the coffee incident. The guard didn't return. And in his absence, the restaurant felt different, freer, lighter, as if the space itself had taken a deep breath. Evelyn came back a week later, wearing a fresh blouse, her smile faint but present. She ordered her usual, black coffee and a biscuit, and took her favorite seat in the corner. The cashier greeted her warmly. Customers she didn't know nodded in acknowledgement. The space felt whole again. She didn't need thanks or recognition. She didn't need her son to stand in front of everyone and declare who she was. What mattered was that she had stood her ground without shouting, without giving in to the moment's ugliness. She had let time, truth, and dignity do the work for her. And in that quiet, steady way, she had reminded everyone who saw it that strength doesn't always need to be loud. Because racism often thrives on reaction, it feeds on the energy it provokes, growing stronger when met with fury alone. But when it is met with an unshakable calm, when it is exposed under the light of truth, it begins to wither. Evelyn didn't see herself as a hero that day. She saw herself as a mother, a woman, a member of a community that had fought for every inch of respect it owned. She had no interest in teaching the guard a lesson for his sake. The lesson was for the space, for the people in it, for her son, and for anyone who might one day face the same quiet cruelty. And perhaps that was the real victory, not in watching him leave, but in knowing he could not stay. When Evelyn left the restaurant that afternoon, she paused outside, the sun warm against her face. She looked back once, not to relive the morning, but to take in the sight of the place as it should be, alive, welcoming, unshadowed. She stepped into the street with the kind of peace that comes from knowing you didn't let someone else's smallness shrink you. Because at the end of the day, prejudice can pour itself over you like hot coffee, sudden, shocking, meant to burn. But you choose whether it leaves a scar or simply stains a shirt. And shirts, unlike dignity, can always be washed.